This is the second session in our 5 Minutes of Church History series, which you remember is 5-minute videos on the subject of church history. This session is going to be designed to help you to get to know the Apostolic Fathers, and it's going to be an introduction followed by a series of videos where we go through each one of the Apostolic Fathers. The Apostolic Fathers is simply a term for the writings of the earliest Christians after the death of the apostles. We're talking about writings that date from about AD 95, stretching back to just after the death of the last apostle, John, probably in the early 90s, all the way through AD 140. So these were the earliest Christian writings that we have after the completion of the New Testament. The Apostolic Fathers were written, they were people who were not apostles, but they knew the apostles. Their lives often overlapped with the apostles. Famously, Polycarp seems to have been a student of the Apostle John, for instance. The writings called the Apostolic Fathers, the authors of the Apostolic Fathers, were not inspired. These writings are not inspired scripture, but they're generally orthodox. They're not among the many heretical writings that date, say, from the 2nd century. The main writings that are included in the Apostolic Fathers are the letter of Clement of Rome, the Bishop of Rome, which dates from about AD 96. The letters of Ignatius of Antioch, a bishop of Antioch, which dates to around AD 110. A document called the Didache, which is the Greek word for the teaching, which is anonymous. We don't know who wrote it, but it is a handbook on church discipline, which dates from about AD 100. The writings of a man named Papias, which date between AD 110 and AD 130. The Epistle of Barnabas, or the letter of Barnabas, which again, we don't know who wrote it. We know it wasn't Barnabas because it dates to about 120 AD, long after Barnabas would have died. A document called the Shepherd of Hermas, supposedly written by a Christian prophet called Hermas, which dates between 100 AD and 140 AD. The letter of Polycarp to the Philippians. Polycarp was a bishop of Smyrna. It was written about AD 110. And then finally, the letter to Diognetus. We don't know, again, who wrote it. But it's a wonderful letter by a Christian, and it was written between AD 100 and AD 150. Hard to determine the date in that letter. These earliest writings reflect a time not of theological development, but rather a time when Christians were focused on preserving the teaching of the apostles, establishing Christian worship practices, and really figuring out how to relate to an increasingly hostile pagan society as a brand new religion emerging out of Judaism. The Apostolic Fathers wrote during a time of persecution by the Roman government because primarily they refused to worship the emperor and to partake in other pagan practices. So, for instance, two of the Apostolic Fathers, Ignatius of Antioch, Polycarp of Smyrna, were martyred by the Romans. Remember that this is a time in which the writers of these documents did not oftentimes have access to all of the New Testament documents yet. They hadn't been distributed widely throughout the empire. And so there's limitations that come with the primitive nature of these documents. This is a time before all the main doctrines of the church had really been worked out yet, and the formulas that we use, like Trinity and about the person of Christ, had been worked out. So these writings are very primitive, and they therefore, as you would expect, contain a mixture of biblical truth and error. There was a heavy emphasis in these writings upon just simply righteous and faithful living rather than on doctrinal issues and formulations. Nevertheless, the people who wrote these writings, we should remember that they were zealous Christians who suffered for the sake of the gospel. And therefore, it behooves us to read these writings, to understand who these figures were, and to get a glimpse of Christianity in these earliest decades of the church after the death of the apostles.